Who determines morality? And who is to say what one person deems as unjust or immoral is also unjust for another individual? For centuries, philosophers have been pondering these exact questions, leading us to various schools of thought. And of the multitude of theories that have been derived in regards to morality, the fundamental argument ultimately comes down to two key arguments, which is between moral relativism and moral absolutism. And these two theories really differ in whether morality is perceived as subjective or objective, with moral relativism much more based on the individual, and moral absolutism much more based on a universal global standard. So hopefully by the end of this speech, the audience is able to understand these two philosophical viewpoints and some of the key arguments for each of them. And all of these arguments are derived from the work of Kreeft, and Kreeft does provide a really good, clear, succinct examples for both of these arguments, and he really establishes a discussion for the validity of both of them. So now I would like to explain and discuss some of the most compelling arguments for moral relativism. So the first key argument I would like to discuss in favor of moral relativism is the argument from social conditioning. And this argument is really just stating that, based on the society to which we are born into, our morals and values change so that we think that we are morally correct. And because these morals are differing by society and are coming from humans, by their very nature they are subjective and relative. And although a lot of people argue that morality is universal because it's a consensus, that's merely because it's the consensus of your society and what you have been brought up into believing. And I believe that this visual aid really illustrates this argument quite well, in that the cartoon demonstrates that the two women perceive their attire and their culture as morally correct, and that although they are discussing the same subject, which is a male-dominated society, and how to protect themselves from that male-dominated society, they are both still morally correct based on moral relativism and based on the culture to which they were brought up in. I think the next great argument for moral relativism is the situational argument. And this argument really just states that morals and values are ever-changing, and the situations to which they are applied are also ever-changing and are so complex that it's impossible to set a universal morality for all instances. And suppose that someone is put in a situation where they have to kill based on war, or maybe to save the greater majority of people. And although thou shalt not kill is definitely moral and is true in most everyday scenarios, morality is so complex and the situations can change so readily that morals have to be subjective to account for these changing situations. One of the last key arguments I would like to discuss in favor of moral relativism is the argument based on evolution. And that just states that morality has been passed on from generation to generation, so that what we perceive as morally correct is only because it allowed those societies that brought them up first to survive. And that morality is not really objective or based on a higher power. It's simply just that the ancestors that survived were using morals and allowing them to cooperate and be altruistic and not descend into utter chaos. So while the moral relativists definitely draw some intriguing points, I would now like to discuss some of the most compelling arguments in favor of moral absolutism. One of the most compelling arguments that the absolutists often bring up is that of tradition, and that throughout the span of human history, the majority of people have been absolutists, or believed in absolutism, at least to some degree. Therefore, absolutism is really an argument of consensus, and the moral relativists are a small minority acting against the whole of human history. Even when we perceive those who are considered the most wise in our cultures, such as saints or prophets, or those who led civil rights movements, they are often moral absolutists, and they believe in morality as an objective issue. The next argument I would like to discuss that is in favor of moral absolutism is that of the moral experience. In a lot of ways, humans often act altruistically and cooperatively, and at their very core, we know what is morally correct. Morality, in a lot of ways, is like that of a sensory experience. And although we may not think of it in times of debate for morality, our morality is always in the background, and although it might be involuntary, it is always present. Suppose, for example, a child is drowning. The majority of people would dive right in without thinking of the consequences that may be associated with saving that child. But because it is objectively and morally correct to save that kid, the majority of people dive in without thinking of how it may harm them or the moral implications behind it. The final argument I would like to discuss in favor of moral absolutism is that of moral language. When humans debate in terms of morality, we do not often discuss our feelings, and if we did, no moral argument would ever get that far. Humans often have principles or values on a higher plane that are always really the true meaning of our debates for morality, or in any form of an argument. Humans, for example, often say things like, "that is not fair," or "how do you have the right to do that?" And although these may not be the strongest implications of moral absolutism, it just goes to show that morality really is objective and it's present in our everyday lives as an objective. Morality truly is a complex issue, and the majority of human history will likely be spent trying to find the best way to approach this topic. However, these two philosophical viewpoints of moral relativism and moral absolutism definitely offer some form of a groundwork to be able to discuss these topics and to shed light on an often confusing and ambiguous region of philosophy. These theories truly offer a stark contrast to morality, with moral relativism much more focused on the individual, while moral absolutism is much more focused on immovable laws of either nature or a higher power. And while philosophers may never truly be able to determine the best way to approach this topic, and that these questions will likely forever challenge humans, there really is only one final question that is left for the audience. Which philosophical theory